In 1876, in the Missouri Ozarks, came the horrifying story of the macabre Fenwick family and the hauntings they tried to hide. A respected family on a lonely ridge. A poorhouse ledger where children's names were written in pencil, then erased. A schoolteacher who noticed faces were missing after the winter thaw. Feed store receipts for quicklime, but no fields were ever treated, a root cellar that echoed at night, and a well sealed tight with new stone. This is how their secret finally surfaced, through one teacher's careful list of the lost and a child's drawing of a dark hole under the floor. But when the county judge dismissed the evidence and the church went silent, who was left to speak for the children? And if the law refused to act, what would the land itself demand in return? We invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the local time. If justice for the forgotten matters to you, subscribe to keep their truth alive. The story begins not with a scream, but with the dry scratch of a pen on brittle paper. In the county seat, inside a clerk's office that smelled of damp wool and old stove ash, a ledger lay open. It was the poorhouse record for the year 1876, its leather cover cracked like dried mud and its pages yellowed by time. The clerk, a man whose job was to account for every soul who cost the county a penny, had a tidy hand. He noted births, deaths, and the intake of those with nowhere else to go. But on one page, next to the entry for the Fenwick family, he had made a note in the margin, the ink slightly darker, as if pressed with sudden urgency. The note read, "Fenwick children taken in. No birth records, no baptism." It was a small detail, a bureaucratic loose end in a place full of them. But in the Ozark Hills, where a person's name and their place in the church book were the stones upon which a life was built, it was an anomaly. It was the first thread pulled from a tapestry of silence. The Ozarks in those years were a world unto themselves. A network of ridge farms and deep, shadowed hollows where life was governed by the seasons and the sound of church bells rolling across the valleys on a Sunday morning. People were self-reliant, but they were also watchful. A neighbor knew the look of another's chimney smoke, knew when a lantern was lit too late in a barn, knew the sound of an unfamiliar wagon on a gravel road. It was a community bound by hardship and a shared, unspoken understanding. You looked out for your own, but you did not meddle without cause. Winters were the true test. Snow could seal the roads for weeks, turning each homestead into an island. Survival depended on what you had stored, and on the quiet trust that if things got too bad, the men from the next farm over would come through the drifts to help. It was into this world of watchfulness and isolation that Miss Clara Dobbins arrived. She was the new schoolteacher, a woman of 24 with a quiet demeanor and a resolve as hard as the local granite. She believed that education was a right, but she also believed in order. To her, a name written down was a promise. A child in her classroom was a soul to be accounted for, not just to the county, but to God and to history itself. She kept a meticulous attendance log, her handwriting as neat and unwavering as her principal's. Every child's name, their age, and the date they enrolled were recorded in crisp black ink. It was this simple act of record-keeping, this insistence on order, that first uncovered the rot hiding in plain sight. In the autumn of 1876, Ephraim and Martha Fenwick enrolled a boy at the school. They said his name was John. He was small for his age, quiet, with eyes that seemed to be watching for something just over his shoulder. Clara noted him in her log. He was there for 3 weeks. He learned his letters. He drew a picture of a house with no windows. Then, one Monday, he was gone. When Clara asked, "Mrs. Fenwick," explained that the boy had been sent to live with relatives in Arkansas, where the air was better for his lungs. It was a plausible story. Children came and went. But Clara made a small pencil mark next to his name. A few months later, after the first big snow had melted, the Fenwicks brought another child, a girl this time. They said her name was Sarah. She, too, stayed for less than a month before she was sent away, this time to an aunt in Springfield. The pattern began to form, a slow, chilling rhythm of appearance and disappearance. A child would arrive at the Fenwick farm. Sometimes they were called cousins, sometimes distant kin taken in out of charity. They would be seen for a few weeks, maybe a season. They would be enrolled in Clara's school, their names entered into her ledger, and then they would vanish. The excuses were always smooth, always believable. A better home was found. A sickness required them to be moved. A long-lost parent had returned, but the children never wrote back. No letters ever arrived from Arkansas or Springfield. they simply ceased to be. The most unsettling detail came the following spring. A boy was enrolled under the name Thomas Fenwick. He was a timid child who never spoke above a whisper. Clara was sure she recognized his face. She went back through her log page by page, her finger tracing the names of the children who had come and gone. She found him. 6 months earlier, he had been enrolled for 2 weeks under a different name. Samuel. When she gently questioned the boy, asking if he'd ever been called Samuel, he looked at her with wide, terrified eyes and shook his head. The next day, he did not come to school. He was never seen again. Clara's quiet suspicion began to harden into a cold dread. She started her own private ledger, a list of the names, the dates they arrived, and the dates they disappeared. The list grew longer. She realized the Fenwicks were not taking children in, they were consuming them. The farm itself, which sat on a windswept hollow at the edge of the county, began to feel like a hazard. Neighbors, when pressed, would admit to strange things. Laughter, they said, could sometimes be heard from the Fenwick's root cellar late at night, even in the dead of winter when no one should be outside. Travelers on the road reported seeing small faces in the windows, only to be told by Ephraim Fenwick the next day that there were no children on his farm. The homestead was a place of inconsistencies, of stories that didn't line up, of children who arrived but never seemed to grow old enough to leave. The teacher's careful list of names was now a list of the lost, a silent testament against the smiling, church-going couple who lived in the hollow. The truth was not yet known, but the shape of it was becoming terrifyingly clear. The danger was not in the woods, or the winter, or the wild animals that roamed the ridges. The danger was the Fenwick homestead itself. Clara Dobbins was not the only one keeping records. In a small cabin on the other side of the valley, the town midwife, a woman named Agnes Miller, kept a diary. For 30 years, she had noted every birth, every fever, and every passing in a worn, leather-bound book. Her entries were short, factual, and written in a spidery script. Speaking of the Fenwick farm, she had made several entries over the years. One from 1875 mentioned being called to the house for Martha Fenwick, who was feeling unwell. The midwife wrote, "Administered tonics for rest." A few months later, another entry. Called again to the Fenwick place. An infant, a boy, did not thrive. The phrase was a common one, a gentle way of recording a loss. But in Agnes's diary, it appeared next to the Fenwick name 3 times in 5 years, always for infants who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly, with no record of their birth. The midwife also noted the weather. In the spring of 1877, she wrote of heavy rains that lasted for a week, turning the creeks into muddy torrents and flooding the wells of half the farms in the county. Yet, she noted, the Fenwick's well, which sat on low ground, remained clear. A neighbor told her it had recently been sealed with a new stone cap, tight as a drum. The midwife found it odd to seal a well just before the spring rains, when fresh water was most needed. The pattern of oddities was not confined to diaries. At the feed store in town, the owner kept ledgers of every purchase. He was a man who remembered who bought what and when. He recalled that every spring, without fail, Ephraim Fenwick would buy 2 large sacks of quicklime. It was used to treat soil, but Fenwick's fields were rocky and fallow. He never planted more than a small garden. The store owner also had receipts for timber. Over several years, Fenwick had purchased enough lumber to build a mile of fencing. Yet no new fences ever appeared on his property. The old ones just grew more rotten. The wood, like the children, simply disappeared. Whispers about Ephraim Fenwick himself began to surface, stirred from the memories of the old men who gathered at the town hall. Several were veterans who had served in the war. They remembered a younger Ephraim, a man who had gone off to fight with a grim sense of duty. But the man who came back was different. He returned, they said, with a taste for order that was cruel. He ran his farm like a military encampment, demanding absolute obedience and silence. They spoke of a coldness in his eyes, a stillness that was not peaceful but watchful, like a predator waiting for its chance. The whispers and ledgers painted a disturbing picture, but it was the land itself that held the most damning evidence. The Fenwick family plot was a small, neglected patch of ground behind the house, choked with weeds. The stones were simple, hand-carved field stones. Clara Dobbins, walking past one afternoon, felt a chill as she read the inscriptions. One stone marked the passing of a child, age 2. Another, right beside it, for a child age 7. Both had died in the same year, yet no one in the county recalled the Fenwicks losing 2 children at once. Other stones bore only initials, the dates worn away by the rain. The ages and names seemed to shift, as if the family's history was being written and rewritten to hide some terrible truth. The most chilling clue, however, came from the one place Clara felt safe: her schoolhouse. While looking through her students' copybooks, she found sketches tucked between pages of arithmetic. They were drawn by children who lived on the neighboring ridge, children who passed the Fenwick farm on their way to school. The drawings were crude, but their meaning was unmistakable. One showed a house with a dark hole in the ground beside it, and small, stick-like figures with no faces being led towards it. Another depicted a single, large figure standing over a row of small, still shapes under a floor. The children couldn't say what they had seen, not in words. But they had drawn it. The midpoint came with the fury of a summer storm. For 2 days, wind and rain lashed the Ozarks. Trees were stripped of their leaves, and the creeks rose over their banks. On the 3rd day, the sun came out, and the news spread quickly. A massive oak tree on the edge of the Fenwick property had been uprooted by the storm. Its tangled roots had torn open the earth, revealing what lay beneath. A group of men, clearing a fallen log from the road, saw it first. It was a bundle, wrapped in rotting burlap. From a tear in the fabric, small bones protruded. Beside it, half buried in the mud, was a single child's shoe, its leather still laced. The sheriff was called. He came, he looked, and he took the bundle away. For a brief moment, it felt as though the secret had finally been torn from the ground. Justice seemed inevitable, but then a new and more insidious silence fell. The sheriff's official report was never filed. The records of the discovery simply went missing from his office. The county judge, a man who played cards with Ephraim Fenwick on Saturday nights, dismissed the entire affair. He declared the bones to be nothing more than unsettled remains from the war, a common enough discovery in those parts. He ordered the matter closed. The truth had been unearthed, held in the light for a single, shocking moment, and then it was deliberately buried again, this time under the weight of official denial. The whispers stopped. The neighbors turned their eyes away. The horrifying story of the Fenwick family was now a secret the whole county was being forced to keep. As autumn gave way to the winter of 1878, a profound silence settled over the hollows. The roads became impassable under heavy snow, isolating the farms once more. But this winter, the silence felt different. It was not the peaceful quiet of a landscape at rest, but the tense, watchful silence of a community holding its breath. The discovery of the bones, and the swift official cover-up that followed, had changed everything. Dread deepened, becoming as much a part of the season as the biting wind and the long, dark nights. On her own small farmstead, Clara Dobbins felt the isolation keenly. The school was closed until the spring thaw, and she spent her days by the fire, her private ledger of the Fenwick children open on her lap. She had not given up. With each passing day, her resolve hardened. She copied down each vanished name onto fresh paper, adding details from her memory. The color of a child's hair, a nervous habit, a favorite story. She was determined that they would not be forgotten, even if the world outside had chosen to look away. But the Fenwick's influence reached further than she had imagined. There had been a witness, a man who might have broken the silence. His name was Samuel Reddick, a farmhand who had worked for the Fenwicks for a season the year before. He was a plain-spoken man, known for his honesty. After the bones were found, Samuel had started talking. He spoke to a few men at the feed store, his voice low, about the nights he had heard digging, about the odd smell that sometimes came from the barn, a smell he said was like nothing natural. He spoke of Ephraim Fenwick's cold rages, and of Martha's tonics that seemed to make the children sleep too deeply. 2 weeks after he started talking, Samuel Reddick was found drowned in the creek. The water was barely a foot deep. The sheriff ruled it an accident, saying he must have slipped on the icy bank and hit his head, but his widow told a different story. She said her husband was a strong swimmer who knew that creek like the back of his hand. She said he had been worried, that he told her he had spoken too freely, and that Ephraim Fenwick had looked at him with eyes as cold as a snake's. Samuel's death sent a clear message to the community. Silence was safety. And the campaign to erase the truth continued. Clara went to the county office, hoping to make copies of her school rolls to bolster her own records. She was told the rolls from the past 2 years had been misplaced. They had vanished, just like the sheriff's report. At the church, she asked the reverend to see the baptismal registry. He was a kind but cautious man who valued harmony above all else. He reluctantly showed her the book. There, she found what she had feared. Several entries for children with no last names, children taken in by the church, had been crossed out with thick black ink blots, rendering them unreadable. The very record of their existence had been scrubbed clean. While the evidence of their crimes was being systematically destroyed, the Fenwicks themselves were cementing their place in the community. They began to present a new face of respectability. Ephraim donated a generous sum to the church roof fund, his name read aloud with gratitude from the pulpit. Martha hosted socials, serving cakes and coffee to the very neighbors who whispered about her behind her back. They moved through the town with an air of untouchable confidence. The predator was not a monster lurking in the shadows. It was a neighbor, a pillar of the community, whose smile was a mask and whose generosity was a weapon. They were buying the town's silence, one charitable act at a time. The final blow to Clara's hopes for official justice came late one evening. A knock came at her door. It was the circuit judge, a man she respected, who had come all the way from the county seat. He did not come in. He stood on her porch, his breath misting in the cold air, and he spoke to her in a low, urgent tone. He told her that for her own good, she needed to stop asking questions. He warned her to let the past stay buried. He did not say who had sent him, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. The law, the very institution she had trusted to protect the innocent, was now protecting the guilty. At that moment, Clara realized the full, horrifying truth. Official justice would not come. The sheriff, the judge, even the church, they had all been silenced or co-opted. The truth was now her burden alone. It lay buried under the winter snow, under layers of fear and complicity, waiting. The long silence of winter had begun, and she was left to keep her lonely vigil, the names of the lost children her only companions in the dark. Years passed. The silence held. Ephraim and Martha Fenwick grew older, their faces settling into the familiar masks of respectable elders. The farm in the hollow remained, a place children hurried past, and adults refused to speak of. Clara Dobbins, now a woman in her late 30s, continued to teach, her hair graying at the temples. She kept her ledger hidden in a locked box under her bed, a private memorial to the children no one else seemed to remember. The truth, it seemed, had been successfully buried. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of working their way back to the surface. In the year 1889, Martha Fenwick passed away in her sleep. After the funeral, her niece, Eliza Cartwright, came from Street Lewis to help settle her aunt's affairs. Eliza was nothing like her quiet, pious kin. She was sharp-minded, curious, and had little patience for the unspoken rules of the Ozarks. She saw the fear in the neighbors' eyes and felt the oppressive quiet that hung over the Fenwick house. Unwilling to let the past remain undisturbed, she began to rummage through the long-neglected corners of the farmhouse. In the attic, covered in a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs, she found a small wooden trunk. It was unlocked. Inside was a collection of items that Martha had hidden away, a secret archive of her own complicity and grief. There were stacks of children's drawings, almost identical to the ones Clara had found years before, crude sketches of dark cellars, of figures with no faces, of a house that looked more like a prison. There was a bundle of letters, written in Martha's own hand, addressed to a sister in Ohio. They were filled with veiled confessions and pleas for help, letters that had never been mailed. And at the bottom of the trunk there was a small Bible. Its pages were stiff with age, and inside the front cover, a list of initials had been carefully written in pencil, only to be violently erased, the paper torn in the process. Eliza knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had found the key to the family's dark secret. She had heard the whispers about her aunt and uncle, whispers she had dismissed as small-town gossip. Now, holding the contents of the trunk, she understood. She packed the trunk into her wagon and, without a word to her uncle Ephraim, drove straight to the home of Clara Dobbins. Clara was an old woman now, her movements slow but her eyes as sharp as ever. When Eliza opened the trunk and laid out its contents on her small kitchen table, Clara's hands began to tremble. It was the proof she had waited more than a decade for. The two women, one young and driven by a newfound shame, the other old and fueled by a long-simmering rage for justice, began to work. They pieced together 20 years of absences, matching the initials in the Bible to the names in Clara's ledger. They cross-referenced the dates of the children's disappearances with the feed store receipts for quicklime and timber. The chain of facts tightened, forming an unbreakable narrative of methodical evil. As they worked, the land itself seemed to be stirring, as if it, too, refused to keep the secret any longer. Neighbors began to talk again, their fear of Ephraim lessened by his age and his grief. They spoke of sounds coming from the sealed well on the Fenwick property, a faint scratching noise that could be heard during the spring thaw. They said the dogs on the surrounding farms refused to drink from the creek that ran past the Fenwick land, whining and backing away from the water's edge. It was as if the ground itself was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of what it held. With the evidence from the trunk and her own meticulous records, Clara Dobbins finally had the weapon she needed. She did not go to the sheriff or the judge. She had learned that lesson long ago. Instead, she went to the editor of the local newspaper, a young man who believed in the power of the printed word. He listened to her story, his face growing paler with each detail. He examined the drawings, the receipts, and the ledger. He agreed to publish it all. The following week, the story ran on the front page. It was not an accusation, but a simple, damning timeline. It listed the names of the missing children, one after another. Beside each name was a date, and beside that, an entry from a feed store ledger or a note from Clara's log. The community saw it in black and white. A child vanishes, and a bag of quicklime is purchased. Another disappears, and timber for a new fence is bought. It was a community ledger of the forgotten, laid bare for all to see. The predator was finally unmasked. There was no trial, no conviction in a court of law. Ephraim Fenwick was too old, the evidence too circumstantial for a legal case. But the verdict of the community was swift and absolute. He was named. He was shunned. His farm was abandoned, the windows of the house smashed by stones thrown in the night. The Fenwick family line, once a source of quiet respect, became a mark of shame. Their name was scattered, their reputation destroyed. The smiling mask had been torn away, and the evil that had festered in the hollow for so long was finally exposed to the light. Ephraim Fenwick did not live long after his public shaming. He died alone in the decaying farmhouse, a bitter and broken man, leaving nothing behind but a cursed piece of land. The hollow farm fell into ruin, its walls torn down by wind and time, its fields overgrown with thorny brush. The story of the Fenwicks became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to frightened children and remind adults of the darkness that could hide behind a neighborly smile. For 12 years, the land lay fallow, holding its breath. Then, in the year 1901, a final, definitive reckoning arrived, delivered not by man, but by nature itself. The last surviving member of the Fenwick family, a son who had left for Arkansas long before the secret surfaced, returned. He was a man in his 40s, with his father's cold eyes and a greedy heart. He had come not to mourn, but to claim his inheritance, intending to sell the land and erase the last trace of his family's shame. That spring the rains came with a vengeance, harder and more relentless than any in living memory. The creeks swelled into rivers, and the valleys flooded. On the old Fenwick property, the saturated earth could hold no more. With a great groaning sound, the ground around the sealed well gave way. The stone cap, once set so tightly, collapsed inward, and the walls of the well imploded, creating a deep, muddy sinkhole. When the floodwaters receded, the truth was laid bare for all to see. The collapsed well had exposed its contents. Tangled in the mud and shattered stones were dozens, perhaps scores, of small bones. Tiny ribs, fragile skulls, the delicate bones of hands that had never grown to full size. The land itself had opened up to deliver the final, undeniable evidence. The truth, quite literally, had risen from the grave. This time, there could be no denial, no cover-up. The last Fenwick son, faced with the physical proof of his family's atrocities, fled the county overnight, never to be seen again. There would be no trial, but there was a reckoning. The community, finally free from the shadow of the Fenwicks, came together to do what the law never could. A service was held in the churchyard. The Reverend Hale, now an old man himself, stood before the congregation, his voice thick with emotion. In his hands, he held the ledger that Clara Dobbins had kept for so long. One by one, he read the names of the lost children aloud: John, Sarah, Samuel, Thomas. Each name, once a whispered secret, was now spoken with reverence, a prayer offered to the memory of a life cut short. The reading took a long time. The list was much longer than anyone had imagined. As the last name was read, a profound sense of peace settled over the crowd. The children had finally been given back their names. They had been counted. They had been remembered. A few weeks later, a group of men from the Veterans Hall went out to the hollow. They filled in the collapsed well, burying the remains with dignity. They tore down the last rotting timbers of the Fenwick house, burning what they could and burying the rest. In the center of the cleared land, they erected a simple wooden marker. There were no names on it, only a single, stark inscription: "For the children lost." The community had restored its moral order. The story was told and retold, at supper tables, in the feed store, and at the Veterans Hall, ensuring that the lesson would not die. The official records had been erased, the legal system had failed, but the collective memory of the people had proven to be the most powerful ledger of all. Their secret, once sealed in stone and silence, had to answer to time. The land remembered, and so did the people.